do you want to distinguish first for maybe some definitions? What do you think the difference is between a socialist country and a communist country, and how should people draw a distinction?
Well, I would distinguish between social democracy, which is, the left that we have usually in the Western world, in the developed nations, people like Biden or people like, Justin Trudeau, people like that, who can be very far left when it comes to the woke issues and all of these value conflicts that we have now in the West. And I believe that they are responsible for endorsing an ideology that will end up destroying the West if they are successful in the end. But they are not these revolutionary socialists that we have now in Latin America, or that we used to have in the Western world during the Cold War. Like you had them in Italy and France, you had them in Germany, you had terrorist groups that were fighting against the establishment, being funded by the Soviet Union, and so on. So I would make a distinction there. And also, if you have countries with more solid institutions, even within Latin America, they are never able to achieve their goal of concentrating power in their own hands. Like Chile is a good example of that. We had a constitutional referendum a couple of years ago, and the left proposed a very radical constitution, a very woke constitution, but at the same time, communist constitution. And over 60% of Chileans voted against that. So we were saved by this decision in the referendum. So they failed in their attempt to, control power. So I would say in the classical definition, socialism and Marxism or communism, they used to be more or less the same during the Cold War. I mean, it would be hard to argue that a socialist was not at the same time someone who believed in the Soviet Union type of system, central planned economy. This is a point that Hayek and Mises were making during the Cold War, fighting against the socialists, because the socialists were arguing for a central planned economy, which in the end would have destroyed all sort of political liberties and democracy as well. So I would distinguish more, as I said, between the social democrats, and within the social democrats you have also more extreme type of people than others, and the socialists and communists. And even if some political parties have the name of socialist, nowadays they are more like social democrats than true socialists that are inspired 100% by the Marxist and Leninist doctrine that they followed in the times of the Cold War. So that's a distinction I would make.
So what we could say, just to clarify this further for everybody watching and listening, is that in countries like, I think the Scandinavian countries are probably the best example of this. The first thing we should note is that they're relatively small countries, and until recently they were relatively homogenous ethnically, and that makes governance more straightforward. The systems simply aren't as complex because there are fewer people, and there is more of an implicit consensus on which way is up and which way is down, let's say. But the Scandinavian countries like Canada, the classic socialists were really free market people, all things considered, believed in private property more or less, but were more interested than the libertarians or the conservatives in producing a broad and encompassing social safety net. And so most of the political action in Canada had to do with the expansion of the social safety net. And that was what the left-wingers and the labor union types were pushing for with a certain degree of success. And the distinction you're drawing on, and you referred to a couple of Austrian economists, Hayek and Mises, is that the communists go full-fledged planned economy, the full-fledged planned economy route, and they are not in favor of private property. They believe that an untrammeled free market, it ends up concentrating economic power in the hands of a very small number of people, and that replacing that with a planned economy would fix that problem, which it certainly doesn't and can't. And I know the Austrians who you referred to also make the case that a planned economy is something that appeals to people who are very presumptuous in their intellect, because the fabrication of any given commodity, consumer item, let's say, or a commodity for that matter, is complex almost beyond it's complex beyond comprehension unless you have a distributed system of pricing to make rational, intelligent decisions. Your economy will eventually grind to a cataclysmic halt.
Exactly.
So I think about it as a computational problem, right? Is that and I think this fits in very well with the Austrian economists' line of thinking, is like, do you want to have a distributed network of computation each person calculating their own hierarchy of values, each person with the eyes on the particulars of their local situation, sum all that together in some distributed manner and allow decisions to be made that way? Or do you want to put decision-making power in the hands of a small group of people who can't hope to know what's going on? You know, I think the Central Committee, the Soviet Central Committee, was making something like 300 pricing decisions a day. And I've run companies where we've tried to price our offerings, and just pricing one thing is almost impossible. And you have to do that in concert with your market. You don't know what something is worth. The best you can do is find out what people are willing to pay for it, given all the other things that they're trying to accomplish simultaneously. So the communist types, they're focusing on a planned economy. Now, let's go back to Venezuela. So before the socialist revolution took place, in your opinion, how was Venezuela doing?
So Venezuela is an interesting case because it had the highest per capita income in Latin America in 1970, and it was the country with the largest degree of economic freedom. You can measure that. The Fraser Institute in Canada does that work of measuring economic freedom. And in 1970, Venezuela was 14 in the world in terms of economic freedom. It was about like 90 countries, more or less, that they were measuring back then. And Chile was one of the last countries because we had the socialist experiment of Salvador Allende, which was an attempt to impose a totalitarian communist system in Chile. And we were last in the country, and we had hyperinflation and scarcity of basic goods and services and so on and so forth. So it was a complete catastrophe that ended up in the coup of 1973, led by General Pinochet. But Venezuela, over time and over the decades, especially after they nationalized in the 70s the oil industry, we have to remember Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. They nationalized it, and they started falling in the ranking of economic freedom systematically. So by the time Chavez came to power in 1988, Venezuela was doing very poorly in the rankings of economic freedom. You had a very kleptocratic, corrupt system that, a rent-seeking society, let's say. Everyone was trying to live out of the government handouts and corrupt deals between the corporate interests and the politicians. And Chavez was elected. He had been a soldier who had attempted a coup in 1992 against Carlos Andrés Pérez. So he was a golpista, what we call a golpista in Spanish. So someone who tried to overthrow a democratically elected president and install a dictatorship. So everyone knew who Chavez was. Many people died in 1992, and he ended up in prison. But well-meaning central leftist in Venezuela pardoned him so he could go out of jail. And then he went to see Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro recognized immediately that he had, a puppet that he could guide in order to take control over Venezuela.